And now we're entering into what's known as postmodern design. Look at 1960 to present. And this opens up a lot of questions. What is postmodern? Why do we consider this period of 1960 to present to be postmodern? And what comes next? And all of these are going to be answered over the next series of videos. Now, a couple of things are changing as we enter into this period. The period of 1960 up until 2020, while I'm recording this, we're seeing an increasingly global society, although it can be argued that after about 2008, we're seeing an increase in nationalism. We're seeing a bit of a decrease in globalization. This is in large part due to a societal shift where we're seeing a push against some of those postmodern ideas of general trade, globalization, everyone getting along. We will see Western import versus export. Now, up until this period, really what we've seen is the West exporting to different areas through colonization, through trade, and pushing their societies elsewhere. What we're seeing during this period after 1960 is a shift where the West will start importing a little bit more than they're exporting. It's a very slow shift. It's the sort of thing that maybe in 100 years historians will talk about, but we're seeing that shift taking place. Look at design, where we're seeing more and more non-Western elements finding their ways into Western interior design. So let's talk about postmodern. Now, pre-modern is really the period of time up until the Enlightenment. And that is a period of time where people rely on religion. They look at God or whatever their form of deity is as the answer for all of their questions. When we hit the Enlightenment, then we enter into the modern era. The idea is there is inevitable progress, that we must observe and study everything. We must categorize the world around us. The postmodern world, well, it's a little different. Postmodernism is a late 20th century style and concept in art, architecture, and criticism that represents a departure from modernism and has at its heart a general distrust of general theories, ideologies, as well as a problematic relationship for us with any notion of art. It's really calling into question all forms of expertise. The idea being that just because you've studied art doesn't mean that you necessarily understand it better than I do. It means that we don't have these grand theories where we sit there and we look back and we go, well, the neoclassical was entirely based on this idea, or the Baroque was entirely based on that idea. We can't do that with postmodernism because things are breaking down from a societal level where you see large societal movements increasingly to an individual level, which means everyone's kind of going in their own different direction, and no one seems to feel the need to look to experts. They believe that they can be their own expert. They know best what's good for them or their family or their children, or you get the idea. So whereas in modernism we see logical thought, in postmodernism they tend to deny logical thought and push towards feelings, the idea being all truth is relative. My truth is equal to your truth, even though my truth might be that the sky is orange and yours is that the sky is blue. We see objective reality versus subjective reality. We see modernism fixated on the past, the study of history, art history, those sorts of things, whereas in postmodernism, they try to ignore the past, although we'll see that that's not a hard line as we look at architecture and furniture. We will see the idea of normative behavior in modernism, the idea being that there's a certain normal envelope in which people should live, versus postmodernism, which looks more at spontaneity. We have structuralism in modernism, whereas we have dissipative structures. So that's society versus the individual. The society moves as a whole in the modern world, whereas society moves as a conglomerate of individuals in the postmodern world. Another way to look at is society, or the individual exists to serve the society in the modern world. Society exists to serve the individual in the postmodern world. In terms of architecture, we'll see an interesting mix. Whereas modernism really was all about function. Let's be very, very efficient. Postmodernism is trying to bring in some classical elements of architecture, but still focus on that modern idea of creating something that is going to be very, very functional. Although we're going to see increasingly sculptural architecture as we move on. One way to think of it is modernism, less is more, whereas when we get to postmodernism, less is a bore. And here's a great example of postmodernism. This is a sculpture by an artist by the name of Joel Shapiro. And what you see at first would appear to be a wooden sculpture of someone doing one of two things, and we'll get to that in a minute. But Shapiro is playing with the viewer. In fact, what you have is a metal sculpture, not wood. So he's calling to question your ability to use your own senses. He has treated the steel so that it looks like wood to trick your eye into believing that it's wood. And the figure could be doing a couple of different things. And it's entirely based on where you're coming from at that moment in terms of how you're going to read it. So you could read this as someone falling or losing their balance, or you could read this as someone dancing. If you're in the middle of finals and barely holding things together, you might see this as someone losing their balance or falling. Whereas if you are having a very positive period in your life, you could see this as someone dancing. And neither one is either right or wrong. That's sort of the postmodernist ideal. Everyone will interpret it differently, and that is intentional. We have definitely moved away from artists like Michelangelo, where there's a single solid interpretation that he's trying to get across. Instead, we have artists trying to call out any number of possible interpretations from the viewer and leaving themselves open to the possibility that the viewer might see it completely differently from the artist.